When you picture a family surviving a frontier winter, you picture the fire, a good stove, a deep wood pile, someone waking at 2 in the morning to feed the flames before the room goes cold. That is what survival looks like. More fuel, more heat, more fire. But the thing that killed families was not a lack of heat. It was the speed at which their cabins gave the heat back. A thin iron stove could blister a room in an hour and abandon it before dawn. The fire was never the problem. The forgetting was. One widow in the Pecos Valley understood that, and she did not reach for more wood. Owen Hart had been dead for 6 days when the county deputy rode out to deliver the paperwork. Marta stood in the doorway of the cabin, 12 by 16 feet of rough plank walls and green-cut timber that still wept sap in the afternoon heat, and watched Tom Bledsoe swing down from his horse with his hat already in his hands. That told her everything. Men on the Pecos Road did not remove their hats for widows, unless the news behind the condolence was worse than the death itself. The cabin sat on a quarter section east of the Santa Fe Road, close enough to the old mission ruins that on clear mornings Marta could see the crumbled adobe walls catching first light. Owen had filed the improvement claim 14 months earlier, and in those 14 months he had raised walls, hung a door, set an iron box stove on a stone slab, and talked endlessly about the spring garden that would prove the land worth keeping. He had not finished the chinking, he had not insulated the floor, he had not cut enough wood, and now he was in the ground behind the mission cemetery, killed when a freight wagon lost its wheel on the grade south of Glorieta and rolled him under the load. Bledsoe came inside because Marta stepped back to let him. She did not offer coffee because there was nothing to brew. The stove was cold. Ben, 4 years old, slept in a flour sack-lined crate beside it, his breathing shallow and quick with the cough that had started 3 days after the funeral. Lena, 9, sat on the single chair with her hands locked between her knees, watching the deputy the way children watch when they have learned that adult visitors bring changes they cannot stop. Bledsoe set a folded paper on the stove lid. He explained it plainly. Owen's improvement claim required continuous residency and demonstrable progress. The land office expected either a completed structure or clear evidence of ongoing work. If the claim appeared abandoned through winter, it would revert. There was no malice in the rule. There was no appeal in the timeline. Winter was coming, and the land office did not care who had died. Marta picked up the paper. She read it once, then again. The words were simple enough: reside, improve, demonstrate. Fail to do so, and the claim reverts to public domain. She asked Bledsoe how long she had. He said the inspector would ride through sometime after first thaw, maybe March, maybe April. If the cabin was occupied, stocked, and showed winter survival, the claim would hold. If it was empty, stripped, or collapsed, the claim was gone. That was when Silas Creed stepped through the door behind Bledsoe, and the room changed. Creed ran the general store in Pecos and held paper on half the homesteaders in the valley. Owen had owed him $27, seed money, nails, flour, a length of stovepipe, salt pork bought on promise against a crop that had not yet been planted. Creed was 46, thick through the shoulders, and careful with his sympathy, the way a man is careful with coin he expects to collect. He had come with Bledsoe not out of kindness, but because the deputy's visit told him everything he needed to know about the claim's future. Creed walked to the stove. He lifted the lid with 2 fingers, looked at the dead firebox, and set the lid back down. "Cold already," he said. Marta said nothing. Creed looked at the walls, the gaps in the chinking, the places where wind would come through by October. He looked at the woodpile visible through the open door. He looked at Ben's crate. He looked at Lena. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "you have a debt that is secured against next season's tools and crop. There is no crop. There may not be a next season. I am not here to be cruel, but I am here to be clear. If you leave this claim before spring, I will need the tools, the stove, and whatever timber can be salvaged. That is the arrangement your husband made." Bledsoe shifted his weight. He did not like Creed being in the room, but he had no authority over a creditor collecting terms. Marta looked at Creed and said, "I'm not leaving." Creed smiled, not a cruel smile, a patient one. The smile of a man who has watched winter settle arguments that stubbornness could not. "Ma'am," he said, "you have maybe 1.5 cords of wood outside. You need 4 to run that stove through to March, and that is if the winter is kind. If it is not kind, you need 6. You have $9. You have 2 children, one of them sick. You have no team, no neighbor close enough to hear you shout, and walls that will pass wind like a sieve by November." He paused. He wanted the math to land before he continued. "I'm not telling you to leave. I'm telling you what staying costs. And I'm telling you that I cannot extend further credit to a situation that arithmetic says will fail." Bledsoe left first. Creed followed. Neither man looked back at the cabin. Lena waited until the hoofbeats faded, then said, "Mama, what is a sieve?" That night, Marta fed the stove everything she could afford to burn. The iron threw heat so fierce that within an hour the room was stifling. Ben sweated through his shirt. Lena kicked off blankets. Marta cracked the door to let cool air in and immediately felt the wind steal what the stove had just given. She closed the door. She banked the fire. She went to sleep beside her children with the room still warm. At 3 a.m, she woke to silence. The stove had gone dead. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped so fast that frost had formed on the inside of the window glass. Ben's face was gray in the moonlight. His breathing had turned shallow and sharp, each exhale a small, wet bark. Lena was curled into herself with her knees against her chest and her hands pulled inside her sleeves. Marta got up. She rebuilt the fire. She fed it too fast because she was afraid, and the room lurched back into punishing heat that made the walls tick and the sap in the green timber hiss. This was the cycle. This was what the iron stove did. It shouted for an hour, then went silent. It blistered the room, then abandoned it. And every time the fire died, the cold came back faster than the warmth had arrived, because the thin metal walls held nothing. They conducted heat outward as eagerly as they conducted it inward. The stove was not a partner in survival. It was a tyrant that demanded constant feeding and gave back only violence, too much, then nothing. Marta sat on the edge of the crate, her hand on Ben's chest to feel each breath, and understood the arithmetic that Silas Creed had laid out. 4 to 6 cords to run this stove through winter. She had 1.5. Standing dead pignon within walking distance might give her another cord if she could fell, buck, and haul it alone while also tending 2 children, one of them sick. That left her short by half, at minimum. If the winter was hard, and winters in the Pecos Basin were hard more often than they were kind, she would be short by 2/3. She could not buy wood. $9.40 would not cover 2 cords, even if someone would haul it. And no one would haul it because Creed had made it clear that extending help to Marta Hart was extending credit to a dead account. She could not leave. She owed the store. She had no team. The passage east cost money she did not have and led to a place she had no one waiting in. Owen had no family left. Her father was dead. Her mother's house in St. Louis had been sold 2 years ago. There was nothing behind her. There was only this cabin, this claim, this stove that screamed and then went cold, and 2 children who needed her to solve a problem that could not be solved by the rules every homesteader in the valley lived by. The question was not whether she could cut enough wood. She could not. The question was whether the stove's hunger could be changed. 10 days after the funeral, Marta walked to Pecos with a sack over her shoulder and Ben riding her hip. Lena walked beside her, carrying the empty flour tin. The road was 3 hours each way, and Marta's purpose was simple: barter what she could for flour and salt, and see whether anyone would trade labor for something she possessed. No one would. Creed had spoken. The valley understood that Marta Hart was a losing position, and lending to a losing position was how homesteaders joined the losing. She traded a wool blanket for 10 pounds of flour and a paper twist of salt. She traded Owen's second shirt for a small bag of dried beans. She stood in the store, feeling the weight of watching eyes, and did not let her face change. On the walk home, she passed the mission ruins. She had passed them before. Everyone on the Pecos Road passed them, but she had never stopped. Today, 2 men from Santa Fe were there, travelers sketching the old walls and poking at collapsed roofing. One of them held up a piece of curved clay tile, orange-brown and heavy, and turned it in the light. Marta stopped, not because of the travelers, because of the tile. It was a Spanish mission roof tile, semi-cylindrical, roughly 20 inches long, formed over a log mold and fired in a ground kiln sometime in the century before anyone alive could remember. Hundreds of them lay broken and scattered among the ruins, half buried in adobe dust and sage. The travelers were collecting them as curiosities. Marta was looking at them as something else. She set Ben down. She walked to the nearest pile of rubble and picked up a tile that had been lying in the afternoon sun. The top surface was warm. She turned it over. The underside, the side that had been shaded, pressed against other rubble, was warmer. Not from the sun, from the mass above it. The heat had traveled through the clay and was still traveling, still moving, still present long after the sun's direct contact had passed. She held the tile in both hands, and something in her memory opened. She was 8 years old, standing in a bakery in St. Louis. Her father, a tile setter from Hesse, was installing a decorative facing around the baker's bread oven. The work was done. The fire had been out for over an hour. Her father took her hand and pressed her palm flat against the glazed tile bench beside the oven. "Feel that," he said. The tile was warm, not hot. Warm, steady, like a living thing breathing very slowly. She asked how. The fire was out. Why was the tile still warm? Her father tapped the clay with his knuckle. "Iron shouts," he said. "Clay remembers." He explained it the way a tradesman explains to a child, simply, without theory, through touch. Iron gets hot fast and lets go fast. Brick and tile get hot slower and hold it longer. A thin iron sheet is like a man who yells and then has nothing left to say. A thick clay wall is like a man who speaks quietly all night. Marta had filed this away the way children file things, completely, without understanding its value. Now, standing in the ruins with a 20-inch tile in her hands and a 4-year-old coughing at her feet, the memory came back with a force that made her close her eyes. She felt the bakery bench under her palm. She smelled yeast and ash. She heard her father's knuckle on clay, and she understood what the iron stove was doing wrong. The stove was not the problem. The stove did what iron does. It took fire and threw it outward as fast as possible, then abandoned the room when the fire died. The problem was that nothing in the cabin caught that heat and held it. The walls were thin plank. The floor was packed dirt with no insulation. The air itself moved too fast, stolen by every gap in the chinking. The stove poured heat into a container that could not hold it, and every night the container emptied. But if she could surround the stove with mass, fired clay, dense and thick, the mass would drink the stove's violent early heat and give it back slowly through the hours after the fire died. The room would not leap from blistering to freezing. It would rise slower, settle slower, hold through the night. She would burn less wood because the heat would work twice, once through the iron, once through the clay. The idea was not a Kachelofen. She did not know that word. She had never seen a European masonry heater. She was thinking in simpler terms. If clay remembers, and she had hundreds of pounds of fired clay lying in rubble that nobody wanted, then she could build a shell around the stove that turned brief, violent heat into slow, steady warmth. The risk was immediate and obvious. If she spent days hauling tile and building a shell, those were days she could not spend cutting wood. If the shell failed, if it cracked, if it ruined the stove's draft, If the mortar did not hold, she would have lost both the labor and the fuel she did not cut. She was gambling the margin she did not have on a principle she remembered from a dead man's lesson in a bakery that no longer existed. She did not decide. Not yet. She carried the tile home, set it on the stove while the iron was hot, and watched. After an hour, she pulled the tile off and held it. It was warm. She set it on the floor beside Ben's crate. An hour later, she touched it again. Still warm. Faintly, but present. The heat was still there. The clay was still speaking after the iron had gone silent. Nora Bell came by the next morning. Nora was 38, 4 winters in the valley, a practical woman with a practical husband, and a cabin that worked well enough because they had done everything by the standard method. Thick chinking, heavy stove, deep woodpile, long nights feeding the fire. Nora was not cruel. She was the kind of neighbor who would share a meal, but not a delusion, and what Marta described sounded like a delusion. "You want to put clay around your stove," Nora said. "Around it, not on it, with clearance, so the air still moves. You want to wall off the only heat source you have." "I am not walling it off. I'm slowing it down." Nora looked at the single tile still warm on the floor. She touched it. Her face showed nothing. "Marta," she said, "I have watched 3 families leave this valley because they tried something clever instead of something proven. Your stove works. It works poorly, but it works. If you tear that room apart to build something you have never built and it fails, you will not have time to go back to what works. You will be out of wood and out of weeks." "I am already out of wood and out of weeks," Marta said. "The stove that works will eat 4 cords I do not have. I need something that eats less." Nora did not argue further. She'd left a jar of broth for Ben and walked home through the sage with her shoulders set in the posture of a woman who expected to bury a neighbor before spring. Marta began the next morning. She made a decision that closed every other door. She would spend 4 days hauling tile from the ruins instead of cutting wood. If the shell failed, those 4 days were gone, and winter would find her shorter than she already was. The gamble was total. She built a hand sled from scrap boards and rope. She loaded Ben into the sled with blankets, carried Lena's hand, and walked to the ruins. She sorted tile the way she sorted everything, by logic and by touch. She rejected crumbled pieces, soft pieces, fragments too small to course. She chose the ones that rang when tapped, the ones dense enough that their weight felt honest in the hand. 8 tiles to a load, 3 loads a day if she pushed. 24 tiles a day, and she needed perhaps 120 to build a shell tall enough and thick enough to matter. 5 days of hauling, minimum. The valley noticed. Of course it noticed. A woman dragging a child and broken orange roof tiles through the slush on a hand sled is not a sight that goes unremarked. The talk started at Creed's store and spread the way all talk spreads in a settlement of 40 souls, completely within a day. Creed said it first, and the line stuck. "She is building a clay coffin for her fire. At that point, you may as well set your stove inside a mud grave." The men on the store porch laughed. The freight drivers laughed. Even the women who might have helped found themselves uncertain because Nora's report had preceded them. The Hart widow was not cutting wood. She was hauling broken tile, and she intended to pack it around her own stove like mortar around a brick. It sounded insane. From the outside, it looked insane. A half-finished cabin with a sick child and a widow who had chosen to spend her dwindling margin on a project that no one in the valley had ever seen, based on a memory of a bakery wall and a tile that stayed warm for an hour. Marta heard the talk. She could not avoid it because every trip to the ruins passed within earshot of the road, and the road passed the store. She heard mud grave repeated twice in one day. She heard a man she did not know say, "Somebody should tell her before she kills those children." She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She knelt at the ruin pile, tested each tile with 2 fingers and a tap, rejected the dead ones, stacked the living ones, and loaded the sled. Ben slept in the blankets. Lena counted tiles. Silas Creed came to the cabin on the 4th day of hauling. He came under the pretense of checking on his collateral, the tools, the stove, the timber, but his real purpose was pressure. He found the cabin floor covered in broken tile, a stone pad half laid beneath the stove, and Marta on her knees sorting fragments by thickness. "Mrs. Hart," he said from the doorway, "I extended credit to your husband for a working homestead. What I see here is a woman dismantling her own shelter." Marta did not stand up. "The stove is still in place. The walls are still standing. The tools are where they were. And the woodpile is not 1 stick larger than it was a week ago." "No. You have been hauling broken roofing tile from a ruin instead of cutting fuel." "Yes." Creed stepped inside. He looked at the tile arranged in courses on the floor, at the stone pad, at the sand and clay she had been mixing in a bucket. "What exactly do you intend to build?" "A shell, around the stove. Clay holds heat longer than iron. If I can store the burn in the tile, I need less wood to hold the room through the night." Creed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Hart, I have wintered in this territory for 11 years. I have seen men with 10 times your resources freeze out of better cabins than this. No one has survived a Pecos winter by walling off their stove in broken roofing. No one has tried. There is a reason for that." He told her plainly. No further credit. No flour, no salt, no seed advance, no nails. If she could not pay cash, the store was closed to her. He told it to her in front of Lena, who was standing by the door holding a tile in each hand. Creed looked at the girl, looked at the tiles, and walked out. Marta sat on the floor after he left. Her hands were raw from hauling. Her knees ached from kneeling on stone. Ben was asleep with his mouth open and his breathing audible from across the room. Lena set down the tiles, walked to her mother, and sat beside her without speaking. The cabin was cold. The stove was empty. The tile was stacked in unfinished rows like the beginning of something that might be a wall or might be a monument to foolishness. Marta did not know which. She knew only that the alternative, feeding an iron box every 2 hours through 5 months of darkness, required wood she could not get, money she did not have, and a body that was already showing the cost of 6 days without rest. She stood up. She mixed mortar. She began laying the first course against the back wall of the stove, 2 inches of clearance between iron and clay, sand heavy at the base where heat would be fiercest. The mortar was wrong. She knew it immediately. Too wet. The tile shifted. She scraped it off, adjusted the mix, and tried again. Better. The first tile held, then the second, then the third. By nightfall, she had a knee-high back wall of curved mission tile mortared against stone, standing behind the iron stove like the beginning of an embrace. She lit the stove for warmth because the children needed sleep. The fire caught, flared, threw its usual savage heat into the room. And for the first time, the back wall of tile began to drink. Marta held her hand near the iron and felt the familiar blast. She moved her hand to the clay. Nothing yet. The mass was cold, absorbing, taking without giving. That was the gamble. The clay needed time. It needed heat poured into it before it would pour anything back. She fed the fire for an hour. Then she let it die. She sat with her back against the plank wall and watched the stove cool. The iron went cold in 40 minutes. She could feel the change, that familiar plunge where the room remembered it was winter. But the tile was warm. She pressed her palm flat against the back wall of mission clay. It was not hot. It was warm, steady, present. The heat was inside the mass, trapped by density, and it was moving outward at the speed of clay instead of the speed of iron. At midnight, the tile was still warm, faintly, at the edge of perception. But there, it was not enough. Not yet. The back wall alone could not hold a room. She needed sides. She needed height. She needed thickness and coverage and a top that captured rising heat before it hit the bare plank ceiling and vanished. She needed 100 more tiles laid right and a mortar mix that would not crack when the shell cycled from hot to cold and back again. She needed help from someone who understood clay the way her father had understood clay. Someone who had worked with fired tile and mortar and heat and knew how they behaved not from books, but from years of touching them. She did not know yet where that help would come from. But the tile was warm at midnight, and that was more than the iron had ever given her. Outside, the first ice of the season crept along the edges of the water trough. The piñon on the ridge stood black against a sky that was emptying of warmth the way the cabin emptied every night, completely without mercy, faster than anyone could replace what was lost. Marta slept with her hand on the clay. In the morning, it was cold. The heat had traveled through and escaped into the room, and the room had given it to the walls, and the walls had given it to the wind. But for 6 hours, the clay had remembered. That was enough to continue. On the 7th day of hauling, Marta met the man who would teach her how to build what she had only imagined. She was at the ruins, crouched over a pile of rubble near the collapsed north wall of the old mission church, tapping tiles and sorting them into 2 stacks, the ones that rang clear and the ones that thudded like wet bread. Ben was wrapped in blankets on the sled, dozing. Lena was carrying fragments to the good pile with the seriousness of a girl who has decided that her mother's work is also her own. Tomas Aragon stood 20 feet away, watching. He was 61, lean from decades of outdoor labor with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same adobe he worked with, scarred, cracked at the knuckles, permanently dusted with the tan powder of dried clay. He wore a wool coat patched at both elbows and a hat that had once been black. He had been walking the ruins the way he often did, checking the walls he had helped repair years ago for the territorial preservation effort, noting where frost and rain had undone another season's work. He watched Marta for a long time before he spoke. What he saw was not a desperate woman grabbing rubble. What he saw was selection. She was tapping each tile and listening. She was rejecting the soft ones. She was choosing by sound, by weight, by the quality of the ring. And she was right. The tiles that rang clear were the tiles that had been properly fired, dense enough to hold their structure, porous enough to breathe, but not enough to crumble. She was doing by instinct what he had spent 30 years learning to do by trade. He walked closer. Marta looked up. She did not know him. He did not introduce himself. He picked up one of her rejected tiles, tapped it, and set it back on the bad pile. Then he picked up one of her chosen tiles, tapped it, and nodded. "You are listening," he said. "Who taught you to listen?" "My father. He was a tile setter." Tomas crouched beside the pile. He picked up a tile she had placed in the good stack and turned it over. He ran his thumb along a hairline crack she had not seen, a fracture that ran diagonally across the curve, invisible on the surface but present in the body of the clay. "This one will split," he said. "Feel here." She felt. The crack was there, a faint ridge under her fingertip that she had missed because the ring had been clean. "A fired crack rings true until it is heated again," Tomas said. "Then it opens. You must check by touch as well as sound." He sorted through her good pile and pulled 4 tiles. Each had a hidden flaw, a firing scar, a moisture pocket, a sand inclusion that would blow under thermal stress. He did not explain these terms. He showed her by touch. He pressed her fingertip to each defect and waited until she nodded. "What are you building?" he asked. She told him. She described the shell, the clearance, the mortar, the principle. She expected him to laugh or shake his head the way Nora had, the way Creed had, the way every person who heard the idea reacted before they finished hearing it. Tomas did not laugh. He picked up a tile, held it flat in both hands, and said, "How thick is your wall?" "1 tile deep at the back. I do not have enough for double courses." "1 tile deep will not hold a full night." "I know. You need mass behind the tile. Stone if you have it. Packed rubble if you do not. The tile is the face. The mass behind it is the memory." Marta stared at him. No one had said anything useful to her about this project since it began. No one had engaged with the idea as if it were real. Tomas was not praising her. He was correcting her, and correction meant he took the thing seriously enough to improve. "Who are you?" she asked. "Tomas Aragon. I have been patching mission walls since before your husband was born." He looked at the ruins around them. "I know how clay holds heat because I know how clay loses it. Every repair I make, the winter undoes half of it. The clay that survives is the clay that was fired right and mortared right. Everything else the frost takes." He did not offer to help. Not that day. He told her 3 things and left. First, her mortar needed more sand at the hot zones, not less. Site setter's instinct was to make mortar rich and sticky, but near the firebox, rich mortar would calcite and crack. Sand-heavy mortar flexed. Second, she must leave a gap at the top of the shell, not seal it, because the stove needed to breathe upward, or the draft would choke and the combustion would go foul. Third, she must never let the shell touch the stovepipe directly. The pipe needed clearance, or the joint would crack and leak smoke into the room. 3 corrections. Each one saved her from a failure she had not yet committed. He came back the next day, and the day after. Each visit was brief, an hour, sometimes 2, and each visit taught her something specific through action, not lecture. He did not talk about heat theory. He showed her how to scrape old lime from salvaged tiles so the mortar would bond. He showed her how to temper clay slip with sharp sand until the mix held a thumbprint without crumbling. He showed her how to set tile in overlapping curves so the courses locked against each other, and the shell could not slump sideways under its own weight. On the 3rd day, he brought a chisel he had made from a railroad spike and showed Lena how to chip mortar drips from the face of the shell without cracking the tile underneath. Lena took to it immediately. Her hands were small enough to reach the joints Marta's could not. Marta asked Tomas why he was helping. He said, "Because you were sorting by ring. Anyone who sorts by ring has already decided to learn. I'm not giving you charity. I'm giving you corrections." That distinction mattered. He was not rescuing her. He was refining what she had already started. The relationship was not savior and victim. It was mason and apprentice, unequal in knowledge, but equal in the seriousness with which they treated the work. The construction moved in stages that the calendar tracked with increasing cruelty. Day 8. The back wall reached shoulder height. Tomas showed Marta how to set angled tiles at the top to deflect rising heat forward into the room instead of letting it hit the ceiling and vanish. They used stone rubble packed behind the tile courses to add mass without requiring more fired clay. The wall was now roughly 4 inches thick at the base and 3 at the top, not a true masonry heater, but a thermal battery that Tomas said would hold 4 hours if the fire was clean and 6 if you burned hot once and let it coast. Day 10. The left side wall went up. This was harder because the clearance between stove and shell was tighter, and the mortar joints had to be precise, or the tile would lean inward under gravity. Marta's hands were split open from the alkaline clay and the coarse sand. She wrapped them in strips of flour sacking and kept working. Ben's cough had settled into a pattern, worse at dawn, better by noon, worse again after dark. Lena heated broth on the stove and carried it to him in a tin cup while Marta and Tomas worked. Day 12. The right side wall matched the left. The shell now enclosed the stove on 3 sides, back, left, right, with the front open for loading wood and clearing ash. The iron box sat inside a terracotta embrace, 2 inches of air between metal and clay, and above the shell a deliberate gap allowed the draft to pull upward through the stovepipe without choking. That evening, Marta lit the first controlled test fire with the 3-sided shell in place. Tomas stayed to watch. He told her to burn hot, not the smoldering overnight burn that homesteaders used to stretch fuel, but a clean, fierce fire that would drive maximum heat into the iron and from the iron into the clay. "You are not heating the room," he said. "You are charging the wall. Give it everything for 1 hour, then let it go." She fed the stove hard. The iron turned red at the base. The room leaped into heat the way it always did, that punishing blast that made the air shimmer and the children squint. But the tile began to change. Marta held her hand against the back wall of the shell and felt the clay warming, degree by degree, as the mass absorbed what the iron was throwing. After an hour, she let the fire die to coals. The iron began to cool. Within 30 minutes, the metal was touchable. Within 45, it was room temperature. The shell was not. Marta pressed her palm to the tile. Warm, not faintly warm, present. The heat was in the body of the clay, inches deep, and it was migrating outward at a pace that felt almost biological, a slow pulse, not a blast. At midnight, the shell was still giving. The room was not warm the way it had been during the fire. It was livable. The difference between blistering then freezing and steady then gradual felt enormous. Ben slept without waking. Lena slept without pulling her blankets over her face. But Tomas did not celebrate. He pointed to the stovepipe collar where it passed through the upper gap in the shell. A thin thread of smoke seeped from the joint, visible only because the morning light caught it at an angle. "That seal is wrong," he said. "The collar is too tight at the top and too loose at the side. When the pipe expands from heat, it will press against the mortar and crack it. When it contracts in the cold, it will leave a gap. You will have smoke in the room every cycle." Marta looked at the joint. She had mortared it herself the day before, proud of the fit. Tomas was right. The mortar was already hairlined where the pipe met the shell. "How do I fix it?" "Loosely. Pack the collar with sand, not mortar. Sand will shift with the pipe. Mortar will fight it and lose." They spent the next day rebuilding the collar. It cost half a sack of sand and a full morning of work that Marta had planned to spend cutting dead pinon from the nearest stand. That was the trade-off. Every day spent perfecting the shell was a day she did not add to the woodpile. The gamble held only if the shell reduced her fuel consumption enough to make the lost cutting days irrelevant. Ephraim Voss appeared on day 14. The authorities' skeptic had not been to Marta's cabin since the week after the funeral, when he had inventoried her resources and pronounced the situation impossible. He came now because the valley talk had reached him, and because Ephraim was not a man who could let a stove modification exist without inspecting it. He stood in the cabin and looked at the shell for a long time. He walked around it. He tapped the tile. He checked the draft by holding a strip of cloth near the stovepipe and watching it pull. "The draw is better than I expected," he said. "Is that all?" Marta asked. "The clearance is tight on the left. If the mortar spalls, you will have tile against iron. That will crack both. Tomas showed me how to pack it with sand fill if it narrows." Ephraim looked at her. "Tomas Aragon?" "Yes." Something shifted in Ephraim's face. He knew Tomas. Everyone in the valley who had worked with adobe or stone knew Tomas. The old mason's involvement changed the calculation in Ephraim's mind, not from impossible to possible, but from foolish to uncertain. He left without offering help and without condemning the project. That silence was more encouraging than anything he could have said. Day 15 brought a thaw that turned the tile path to mud so deep that the hand sled sank to its rails. Marta lost a full load. 8 tiles cracked when the sled tipped in a rut, and the tiles struck each other edge-on. 8 tiles was a day's hauling. She stood in the mud with broken clay in her hands and wanted to stop. She did not stop. She hauled a replacement load the next day in freezing wind that cracked her lips and made her eyes water so badly she could not sort by sight. She sorted by touch and ring alone. Day 17. Tomas disappeared. His sister in the village south of Pecos was ill, and he left without word. He had been coming every day. His absence felt like a wall removed. Marta continued alone, laying the upper courses by memory of what he had shown her, checking each joint by running a dampened finger along the seam to feel for gaps. She found 2. She corrected them. She found a third that she was not sure about, and she left it, trusting that if it failed, she would see the smoke before it mattered. Day 19. Tomas returned. He said nothing about his absence. He inspected the work she had done alone, pointed to the joint she had been unsure about, and said, "That one will hold." It was the closest he came to praise. Day 20. Nora Bell came back. She brought 2 sacks of sand and an afternoon's labor. She did not say the shell would work. She said, "If Tomas is spending time here, the least I can do is carry sand." The trade was explicit. Nora's sand and labor in exchange for Tomas, showing her how to patch the bread oven at her own cabin after winter. It was not charity. It was barter. It was respect disguised as commerce, the way frontier people made generosity possible without the weight of debt. Day 21. The top courses went on. These were the hardest because the tile had to span the gap above the stove without collapsing under its own weight. Tomas showed Marta how to build a temporary timber lintel, lay the tile across it, mortar the joints, and remove the lintel after the mortar set. The top was not sealed. A service gap remained, wide enough to reach in with a tool if the stovepipe collar needed adjustment, narrow enough to trap rising heat against the tile before it escaped. The shell was complete. Marta stood back and looked at it. The iron stove had become something else. It sat inside a terracotta jacket, curved orange tile on 3 sides and above, stone rubble packed behind, sand fill at the joints where expansion would stress the mortar, a clear front opening for loading and ash, a vented gap at the top for draft and access. It looked like nothing anyone in the valley had seen. It looked, if she was honest, like what Silas Creed had said it would look like. A mud grave for a fire. But graves held things. That was the point. Marta ran the first full overnight test on day 22. She lit at dusk, burned hard for 90 minutes. Clean, dry pinon, split small, fed fast, and then let the fire collapse to coals. The iron screamed hot for the first hour. The room rose past comfortable into punishing. Then the iron began to cool, the coals settled, the fire went to ash. She marked the hours on the door frame with chalk. At the 1-hour mark after the fire died, the iron was cooling fast, but the shell was at full warmth, radiating evenly from all 3 sides and the top, pushing heat into the room at a pace that felt like breathing instead of shouting. At 2 hours, the iron was cold. The shell was warm. The room had dropped, but not plunged. At 4 hours, midnight, the shell was still giving. The children slept. The room was not warm the way a roaring fire made it warm. It was endurable. It was the difference between waking every 2 hours to feed the stove and sleeping through until dawn. At 6 hours, 2 in the morning, the shell was fading. The outer tile was cool to the touch, but the interface, the side nearest the dead stove, still held warmth. The room had dropped further, but the water in the wash basin had not frozen. In a normal night without the shell, that water would have been ice by midnight. Marta added a small fire at dawn, not the desperate, panicked rebuild she was used to, a modest fire, just enough to recharge the shell for the morning. The clay drank the new heat eagerly, already warmed from the night, and within 30 minutes the room was comfortable again. She calculated. On a normal night she burned 3 to 4 armloads of pignon, fed in shifts, to keep the room survivable. Last night she had burned 2 armloads, 1 large charge at dusk, and 1 small recharge at dawn. If that held, the shell would cut her fuel consumption by 1/3, maybe more on milder nights, maybe less on the worst ones. But the worst ones had not come yet. Ephraim came by again. He said the draft was holding and the clearance had not shifted. He did not say it would work through a real cold snap. Nora came by. She touched the shell in the afternoon and felt the warmth still present from the morning recharge. She said, "That is something." She did not say it was enough. Tomas sat with Marta after the others left. He did not praise the shell. He made her explain it back to him, every layer, every joint, every clearance measurement, every choice about mortar composition. He interrupted when she was wrong. He nodded when she was right. He was not teaching anymore. He was testing. "If I'm not here," he said, "and the collar cracks, what do you do?" "Sandpack, clear the mortar, let the pipe float." "If the back wall spalls and you lose a tile?" "Replace from stock, sand heavy mortar, let it cure before full heat." "If the top courses sag?" "Shore with a timber brace, remortar when the shell is cold." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You will be all right." It was the most he had ever given her. November tightened. The sky lowered. The peaks west of the valley went white and stayed white. The piñons on the ridge bent under wind that came from the northwest and carried the smell of snow. Marta cut wood when she could, short sessions between shell maintenance and child care, and stacked it against the cabin wall. Her pile was still short, 2 cords and a fraction maybe. If the shell worked as the test night suggested, 2 cords might carry her to March. If it did not, if a sustained cold snap outran the clay's capacity, she would burn through the pile by January and have nothing left. Ben's cough had improved with the steadier nighttime warmth, but he was thin. Both children were thin. The flour was running low. The beans were gone. Nora brought a jar of preserved tomatoes and half a smoked rabbit haunch, and Marta traded 2 hours of Tomas's oven patching advice for a sack of cornmeal from another neighbor. The economy of survival was tight and getting tighter. The sky told her what was coming before anyone said it aloud. The clouds built from the west in layers, high, thin mare's tails first, then thicker rolls of gray, then a solid lid that pressed down on the valley and turned the light flat and metallic. The temperature dropped in stages, cool, cold, bitter, then still. The stillness before a northern New Mexico storm was the worst part, because the air went so quiet that every sound carried: a horse stamping a mile away, a door closing across the valley, a child coughing inside a cabin. The storm arrived on a Tuesday in late November. It did not announce itself with wind. It announced itself with snow that fell straight down in flakes the size of coins, so thick that by noon the road was gone. By mid-afternoon, the piñon on the ridge were shapes without detail, white columns against a white sky. By dusk, the world had closed to the distance between the cabin and the woodpile. and even that distance required a rope tied to the door frame because the snow was above Lena's knees and still falling. Ben spiked a fever that same morning. His forehead burned under Marta's hand. His cough turned wet and deep, pulling from somewhere in his chest that made each exhale sound like tearing cloth. He would not eat. He would drink broth if Lena held the cup to his mouth. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, and he called for his father twice before Marta could quiet him. She could not reach a doctor. The road was buried. The nearest physician was in Santa Fe, a full day's ride in good weather. There was no good weather. There would not be good weather for days. Ben's fever would break on its own, or it would not, and either outcome would happen inside this cabin, with this stove, behind this shell of broken mission tile that the entire valley had called a mud grave. Marta lit the stove at 4 in the afternoon, earlier than usual. She burned hard. She fed it the driest pagnon she had, split fine, stacked tight in the firebox so the flames climbed fast and clean. Tomas had taught her that a clean burn was essential, smoldering wasted heat as smoke, and deposited creosote that would choke the pipe. A clean burn drove maximum energy into the iron and from the iron into the clay. She needed every degree the shell could hold, because this was not a test night. This was the night. The stove roared. The iron heated until the fire brick lining glowed visible through the draft slots. The room climbed past comfortable into punishing, the familiar first stage that Marta had learned to endure because it was the price of charging the shell. The tile began to warm. She could feel it progressing, course by course, from the base upward. The back wall first, then the sides, then the upper courses. The clay was drinking. After 90 minutes, she let the fire settle. She did not let it die completely. She kept a bed of coals alive, smaller than she would normally maintain, but present. A safety margin. The shell would do most of the work, but the coals would keep the iron from going fully cold and would provide a base for quick recharge if needed. The first hour after the burn was steady. The room dropped from punishing to warm. The shell radiated. Ben lay on the cot. They had moved him from the crate to a proper bed of stacked blankets on a plank frame, with wet cloth on his forehead, and a second blanket pulled to his chin. His breathing was rapid but regular. Lena sat beside him, stroking his hair the way she had seen her mother do, with the same focus, the same refusal to look at anything except the task in her hands. At 8 in the evening, the temperature outside dropped again. Marta could feel it in the walls. The plank chinking let cold press through in fingers of air that found every gap. She stuffed rags into the worst cracks. She hung a blanket over the window. She pushed the children's bed closer to the shell and farther from the walls. At 10, the room was still warm. The shell was performing. The coals in the stove were low, but alive. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the wind had started. A steady northwest blow that drove powder against the cabin wall with a sound like sand on paper. The temperature was dropping fast. At midnight, Marta checked the shell. She pressed her hand to each surface, the way Tomas had taught her, reading the clay like a page. The back wall was warmest. It had the most mass and the closest proximity to the stove. The sides were warm, but beginning to cool at the top courses. The upper shelf was the coolest, which made sense because heat rises and the upper tiles had charged last and held less total mass. The room was holding. Ben's fever had not broken, but had not climbed. He slept in the restless, muttering way of sick children, turning and kicking, but not waking. Lena was asleep beside him, one arm across his chest. At 2 in the morning, the crisis deepened. The wind increased. The cabin creaked. A gust found the stovepipe where it exited through the roof and pressed down on the draw, and for a terrible moment the draft reversed. Smoke pushed backward through the fire brick and seeped from the collar joint where the pipe met the shell. The room filled with the sharp bite of wood ash and char. Marta was on her feet instantly. She opened the front loading door and checked the draft. The coals were smoldering wrong. The reversed pressure had collapsed the air column. She needed to reestablish the draw. She opened the lower vent fully and held a burning splint of pinon at the pipe opening to warm the air column and pull the draft upward. It took 3 tries. The first splint blew out. The second caught, but the draw did not pull. The third held long enough for the column to warm and the draft to reverse back to normal. Smoke cleared, but the collar was leaking. The seam where Tomas had shown her to pack sand instead of the mortar had shifted during the pressure reversal, and a thin whisper of smoke seeped from the joint even after the draft corrected. Marta climbed onto the chair. She mixed ash paste with wet clay from the bucket by the door and pressed it into the seam with her fingers. The shell was hot. The clay burned her wrist, a stripe of pain across the inside of her forearm where skin met heated mortar. She flinched. She did not stop. She packed the seam until the smoke ceased, then climbed down and pressed a cold, wet rag against the burn. At 3 a.m, the wind dropped. The silence was worse than the noise, because silence in a storm meant the cold had deepened past the wind's ability to move it. The air outside went still and dense and brutal. Marta could feel the temperature falling through the walls the way water falls through sand, not fast, but without pause. The cabin was losing heat from every surface. The shell was the only thing giving it back. She added wood. Not a full charge. She did not have the fuel for that, but 4 sticks of dry pinon, enough to relight the coals and give the shell a booster charge. The fire caught. The iron warmed. The clay, still holding residual heat from the evening burn, absorbed the new energy faster than cold clay would have. Tomas had explained this, that warm mass charges faster than cold mass, that the shell became more efficient the more consistently it was used. The room stabilized. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next morning is when everyone who laughed has to step inside and feel the wall for themselves. At 5 a.m, still dark, still cold, the room was holding, not warm, survivable. The water in the wash basin had skinned with ice at the edges, but had not frozen solid. Ben's blankets were not frosted. His breathing had shifted, still congested, still wet, but slower, deeper. The fever was not climbing. Marta sat on the floor between the cot and the shell, her back against the warm tile, her burned wrist throbbing, her eyes open in the dark, and counted breaths. His, hers. The slow radiation of heat from the clay into the room, invisible but present, like a promise being kept 1 degree at a time. Dawn came gray and still. The storm had spent itself. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the valley floor, with drifts against the cabin wall that reached the windowsill. The stovepipe wore a cap of ice. The sky was the color of tin. Marta lit the morning fire. The shell absorbed. The room warmed. Ben opened his eyes and asked for water, and Marta nearly broke because asking for water meant the fever was loosening its grip, and loosening meant he had made the night, and making the night meant the shell had held when it mattered, in the cold, in the dark, in the hours when iron would have gone dead, and the room would have frozen, and the cough would have deepened into something she could not bring him back from. She did not cry. She heated water and gave him the cup. An hour after dawn, Nora's husband appeared at the door. He was red-faced and breathing hard. He had been up since 2 a.m, feeding his own stove, the conventional iron box that every cabin in the valley ran, because the fire kept dying and the cold kept coming. He had burned through more wood in 1 night than he normally used in 3. He looked at Marta's cabin. The room was warm. The children were alive. The stove was barely lit, a maintenance fire, not a survival blaze. He did not say anything. He looked at the shell. He touched it. He left. Ephraim Voss came at mid-morning. He had spent the storm checking on homesteads within walking distance, because that was what Ephraim did. He was the man who made sure people were alive after the worst nights. He had found one bachelor nearly frozen in a cabin east of the road, stove dead since before dawn, the man wrapped in every blanket he owned and still shaking so hard his teeth had cracked a mug he was holding. Ephraim had rebuilt the man's fire and stayed until the shaking stopped. Then he walked to Marta's cabin. He stepped inside and stopped. The room was warmer than his own had been at the same hour. He looked at the shell. He removed his glove. He placed his palm flat against the terracotta. He held it there for a long time. The clay was warm, not hot. Warm, steady. Still giving back the heat of a fire that had burned hard the evening before and been fed only twice since. Ephraim did not say the shell worked. He did not concede that he had been wrong. What he said was simple and more powerful than either of those things. "I told you what iron does," he said. "I forgot to ask what clay might do to iron." He put his glove back on. He looked at Ben, sleeping now with his breathing quieter than it had been in weeks. He looked at Lena, who was eating cornmeal mush from a tin plate with the steady appetite of a child who had slept warm and woken safe. He looked at Marta. Her wrist was wrapped in a rag. Her hands were raw. Her face was gaunt with weight she had lost to labor and worry. She looked like a woman who had been in a fight and won, but the fight had taken everything that was not essential and left only the parts that could not be broken. Ephraim left without another word. Outside, the valley was white and silent. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns, the desperate, constant fires of families who had burned through the night the conventional way, feeding iron that forgot everything by midnight and demanded more by 2. Marta's stovepipe carried a lighter thread. Her shell was still speaking. The storm had cost her 4 armloads of pignon. On a normal night with a bare iron stove, the same storm would have cost her 8 or 9, and the room would still have gone cold between feedings. The shell had not eliminated the fuel problem, but it had cut it. And cutting it might be the difference between a woodpile that lasted until March and a woodpile that ran out in January. She did not know yet. She would not know until the winter was over and the inspector came and the claim held or did not hold. But the shell had carried her through the worst night so far, and the child had lived, and the clay was still warm at dawn. That was not everything, but it was enough to continue. Word traveled the way word always travels in a valley of 40 souls, not through announcement, but through absence. The families who had burned through the night noticed that Marta Hart had not. The men who had stacked 8 armloads beside their stoves at dusk and found nothing but ash and cold by dawn noticed that Marta's stovepipe carried a thin, steady thread of smoke instead of the desperate belching columns that marked a household in crisis. Nobody said it aloud at first. Nobody walked to Marta's cabin and admitted they were curious. But within 3 days of the storm, every homesteader within walking distance had found a reason to pass her door. Nora Bell came first because Nora had been watching longest and had the least pride to swallow. She came in the morning with her brother, a man named Asa, who had wintered 4 seasons in a cabin south of the road and considered himself knowledgeable about stoves. Asa did not believe what Nora had told him. He believed stoves were stoves, and the only variable that mattered was how much wood you could stack. Marta let them in. The stove held a low-maintenance fire, barely more than coals. The room was warm. Asa looked at the shell and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he walked to the back wall and pressed his palm flat against the tile, the way everyone did. because the warmth was the kind of thing you could not believe until you felt it yourself. "How long since the last full burn?" he asked. "Last night, 7 hours ago." Asa removed his hand. He looked at the tile, at the mortar joints, at the clearance gap above the stove. He looked at Nora. He said, "That is something I have not seen." Nora did not say she had told him. She said, "Marta, show him the mortar." Marta explained the sand-heavy mix at the hot zones. She showed Asa the difference between the base mortar, which was coarse and flexible, and the upper mortar, which was finer and harder because the thermal stress was lower near the top. She showed him the sand-packed collar joint that allowed the stovepipe to expand and contract without cracking the shell. She showed him the deliberate gap at the top for draft and service access. Asa listened the way men listen when they are learning something from a woman and are not sure how to hold the knowledge without it changing the shape of what they thought they knew. He did not argue. He asked 3 questions about tile thickness, about recharge timing, about how cold the room got at the lowest point before dawn. Marta answered each one with numbers. She had been marking the door frame with chalk for weeks. She had data, crude but consistent, and she offered it without embellishment. Nora's conversion was quieter. She had been half-believing since the first overnight test. Now she stood in the warm room with her coat still on and said, "How much wood did you burn last night?" 2 armloads, 1 charge at dusk, 1 recharge at 2. "We burned 7. That was the number that mattered, not the warmth of the tile or the elegance of the mortar or the cleverness of the design. The wood, the fuel, the thing every homesteader measured their winter against. Marta's shell had cut fuel consumption by more than half on the worst night of the season so far. If that held, if the shell could sustain that ratio through January and February, then Marta's short wood pile might carry her to spring after all. 2 days later, Ephraim brought a man named Gus Painter, a rancher from the east end of the valley who was losing a fight with his own stove. Gus's cabin was larger than Marta's, 16 by 20, but his iron stove was the same type, and his winter pattern was the same. Burn hard, sweat, sleep, wake to cold, burn again, exhaust the pile, worry. Gus had heard the talk and dismissed it. Ephraim had not dismissed it, and Ephraim's word carried weight because Ephraim did not endorse things he had not tested with his own hands. Gus touched the shell. He said, "I would need more tile than this. My room is bigger." Marta said, "You would need more mass, not necessarily more tile. Stone behind the courses adds mass without tile. Packed rubble works. Adobe brick works if it is fired hard enough. The tile is the face. The mass behind it is what holds the heat." She was teaching. She did not notice the shift, but Tomas did. He was sitting in the corner watching, and he saw the moment Marta stopped explaining what she had built and started explaining how anyone could build it. The knowledge had moved from her hands to her voice, and the voice was steady. Gus left with measurements scratched on a piece of bark. He did not thank Marta. He thanked Ephraim for bringing him, which told Marta everything she needed to know about how slowly the social order would change. But the measurements were on the bark, and the bark was in his pocket, and by the following week Gus Painter was hauling stone from a creek bed to pack behind a half-course of tile his son had scavenged from the mission ruins. The method was spreading, not fast, not with praise, but spreading. Silas Cree did not come to the cabin. He did not touch the shell. He did not ask questions. What he did was talk, and in a valley of 40 souls, talk was a weapon with range. He told people the storm had been mild, that any stove would have held through a night like that with a little care. He told people the shell was a trick of the weather, not a trick of the clay. He told people that Marta Hart was a widow trading on sympathy, and that the old Mexican mason was building her a shrine to foolishness that would crack and fail the first time a real freeze hit. He said these things at the store, where every transaction began or ended, where credit was extended or denied, where the social economy of the valley ran through his hands like water through a sluice. He did not need to convince everyone. He needed to make people hesitate, because hesitation was enough. A family that hesitated to copy the shell would burn more wood, buy more wood, extend more credit, and remain dependent on the store. Marta heard the talk through Nora, who heard it from Asa, who heard it at the store counter while buying nails. The chain was clear and the message was simple. Silas Creed was not done. She did not respond. She did not defend herself at the store or on the road or to the families who came to look. She let the shell speak. She let the chalk marks on the door frame accumulate. She let the children sleep through the night and the woodpile shrink slower than anyone else's. These were arguments that Silas could not answer with talk because they were made of numbers, and numbers did not care who owed what to whom. But Silas was patient, and winter was long, and the next freeze had not yet come. Tomas came to the cabin every day through late November and into December. The construction was done, but the teaching was not. He shifted from building to refining, showing Marta how to read the shell's behavior the way he read adobe walls, by touch and by time, and by the small signs that preceded failure. He taught her to run her hand along the mortar joints each morning and feel for spalling, the fine grit that meant a joint was losing bond. He taught her to listen for the tick of expanding tile during the hot charge and to distinguish between the healthy tick of even expansion and the sharp crack of a tile under uneven stress. He taught her to wet test the collar joint by holding a damp cloth near the seam and watching for the faint pull of draft leaking where it should not. These were not emergency skills, they were maintenance skills, the knowledge that separated a structure that lasted one winter from a structure that lasted 10. Tomas called it listening to the wall, and he meant it without metaphor. The wall would tell you when it was failing if you paid attention. Most people did not pay attention because most people treated walls as finished things. Tomas treated them as living systems that aged, shifted, and needed care. In exchange, Marta gave Tomas something he had not expected, a student who argued. She questioned his mortar ratios. She asked why the sand content at the base had to be exactly what he said and not higher. He showed her, mixed a richer batch, applied it to a test joint on the back wall, fired the stove hard, and watched the joint crack within 2 cycles. The failure was the lesson. He did not need to explain it. She saw. She questioned the clearance between iron and clay. She wanted it tighter, more mass closer to the heat source, capturing more energy. Tomas said no. She asked why. He said, because if the tile touches the iron, the tile becomes the stove. It will cycle like iron, fast heat, fast loss. The air gap forces the tile to absorb radiation, not conduction. Radiation is slower. Slower is what you want. She understood, but she tested it anyway, pressing a single tile against the iron during a burn and then comparing its cooling rate to a tile at 2 inches of clearance. The contact tile cooled nearly as fast as the iron. The clearance tile held warmth 3 times longer. She did not argue again about clearance. Tomas was pleased, though he did not say so. He told her instead about the churches he had worked on, the mission at Pecos before it was fully ruined, a chapel south of Santa Fe where the adobe walls were 4 feet thick and held the cool of morning until afternoon, an oven he had rebuilt for a family in Chimayo, where the bread came out even because the thermal mass was deep and patient. He spoke about these things while working, while scraping mortar, while sorting tile, while reseeding a course that had shifted a 1/4 inch during a thermal cycle. The stories were not sentiment. They were case studies. Each one taught Marta something about how mass and heat behaved over time in different thicknesses, with different materials, under different conditions. She filed them the way she had filed her father's lesson, completely, without knowing when they would matter. One afternoon in early December, Tomas and Marta disagreed sharply. She wanted to add a fourth wall to the shell, a front panel with a loading door built in, fully enclosing the stove. More mass, more capture, more stored heat. Tomas said no. "You will choke the combustion," he said. "The front must breathe. The fire needs to see the room." "The fire does not see anything. It needs oxygen, and the oxygen comes from the draft below, not from the front opening." "You're thinking like a stove. Think like a room. The front opening gives radiant heat directly into the space during the burn. If you close it, you lose the immediate warming and gain nothing. The tile will store more heat, but the room will be colder during the charge, because nothing reaches the air directly." Marta saw it. The shell was a hybrid, part direct radiant heat during the burn, part stored radiant heat after the burn. Closing the front would turn it into a pure storage system, and a pure storage system required a much larger mass to work. Her shell was too small for that. The open front was not a flaw. It was a design feature. "You are right," she said. "I am right because I made that mistake 20 years ago," Tomas said. "I sealed an oven door and the bread burned on one side and stayed raw on the other. I spent a day reopening it." He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile. Tomas stopped coming on the 14th of December. His sister's illness had worsened, and he left the valley to care for her. He told Marta he would return when he could. He did not promise a date. He corrected one last joint before he left, a mortar seam near the stovepipe collar that had begun to show a hairline crack from thermal cycling. He worked on it with shaking hands. The cold was in his bones now, and his fingers did not close the way they once had. He packed the joint, smoothed it, tested it with a wet cloth, and declared it sound. He looked at the shell. He looked at Marta. "Stop building pretty," he said. "Start building honest. Pretty impresses the eye. Honest survives the winter." He picked up his chisel and his coat and walked out through the snow. Lena watched him go from the window. Ben, well enough now to sit upright and eat solid food, asked where the old man was going. Marta said he was going to take care of someone who needed him. That night she sat with her back against the warm shell and felt the absence the way you feel a wall removed from a room. Suddenly there was more space than you wanted, and nothing to lean on in the direction you had grown accustomed to leaning. Tomas had not been there long, a few weeks. But in those weeks, the project had gone from desperate improvisation to something that worked, and the difference was not just his skill. It was the confidence that came from being corrected by someone who took your work seriously enough to improve it. She was alone with the shell now. If the collar cracked, she would fix it with sandpack. If the back wall spalled, she would replace the tile from stock. If the top courses sagged, she would shore with timber and re-mortar when the shell was cold. She knew the answers because Tomas had tested her. She knew them in her hands, not just in her memory. The clay was warm against her back. The room was quiet. Outside, the stars were out for the first time in days, hard and bright in the cold, and the piñon on the ridge stood black against the sky like sentinels that had outlasted everything the weather could send. The secondary crisis came in January, and it came from outside Marta's cabin, a family named Schofield, husband, wife, 3 children. The youngest, an infant born in September, lived in a cabin 2 miles west of the road. They had wintered poorly. The husband had injured his back felling timber in November and had not been able to split or haul since. The wife had kept the stove running through December, but the woodpile was nearly gone by the new year, and the cold was not relenting. The infant coughed the way Ben had coughed, wet, deep, persistent. Nora brought the news. She came to Marta's door on a morning so cold that the spit froze before it hit the ground and said, "The Schofields are in trouble. Ruth is alone with the children. The wood will not last the week. The baby sounds bad." Marta could have stayed in her warm room and said nothing. She owed the Schofields nothing. She barely knew them. She had her own children, her own woodpile, her own fragile margin to protect. She put on her coat and walked to the Schofield cabin with Nora. What she found was what Ephraim had found at her own cabin months earlier, a family running out of time. The stove was a standard iron box, smaller than Marta's, in a room slightly larger. The walls were better chinked, but the floor was bare-packed earth with no insulation. The woodpile outside held maybe a cord and a half. The husband sat propped against the wall with his back wrapped in strips of wool, unable to bend or lift. Ruth Schofield stood by the stove with the infant on her hip, and the look of a woman who had already calculated the arithmetic and found no answer. Marta looked at the stove. She looked at the walls. She looked at the pile outside. "You cannot cut enough wood to run this stove through January," she said, "but you might not need to." She explained the shell, not the theory, the practice, what it required, what it cost, what it did. She explained it the way Tomas had taught her to explain it, through specifics, through numbers, through the mortar and the tile and the clearance and the burn pattern. Ruth listened. The husband listened. Nora listened, though she had heard it before. The problem was material. The Schofields had no tile. They had no transport to the ruins. They had limited stone and no adobe brick. Marta looked at what was available. Creek stone, packed dirt, some fired brick from an old chimney that had collapsed in the fall. Not ideal, not tile, but mass was mass. And even a crude shell of creek stone and mud mortar would store more heat than bare iron radiating into empty air. Marta went back to her cabin and returned with tools, with sand, with mortar clay she had mixed and stored. She brought 14 tiles from her own reserve stock, pieces she had kept for repairs, and she brought them knowing that if her own shell cracked, she would have less to fix it with. That was the cost. Generosity in winter was always paid in margin. She built, not the elegant curved tile shell that Tomas had helped her construct, but a simpler structure, a 3-sided wall of creek stone and tile fragments, mortared with sand-heavy clay, packed with rubble behind the face courses. The clearance was wider than her own because the materials were rougher, the mass was less even, but the principle was the same. Capture the violent early heat, release it slowly, cut the number of night feedings, and stretch the wood pile. She worked for 2 days. Ruth helped with mortar. The older Schofield children carried stone. The husband watched from his pallet and asked questions that told Marta he was learning despite his inability to work. On the second day, Nora arrived with Asa, who carried a load of stone on his back because he had no sled and the road was too deep for a wagon. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. They fired the shell on the second evening. It was crude. The stone courses were uneven. The mortar was too wet in places and too dry in others. 2 joints would need to be redone within a week. But the mass was there, and the mass did what mass does. The iron stove charged the stone. The stone held the heat. The room stayed warm past midnight for the first time since November. Ruth Schofield cried. She did not cry when Marta arrived. She did not cry when the shell went up. She cried when she woke at 2 a.m, and the room was still warm and the infant was sleeping, and she understood that she would not have to choose between the woodpile and the baby for at least 1 more week. Marta walked home through the snow the next morning. She was exhausted. Her hands were worse than they had been during her own construction. The creek stone was rougher than tile, and the mortar had torn fresh splits in skin that had only just begun to heal. But the Schofield shell was up, and the Schofield children were warm, and that mattered more than her hands. When she reached her own cabin, she found that Silas Creed had been there. Lena told her. He had come, looked at the stove, looked at the shell, and left without speaking. Lena said he had touched the tile. She said his face had changed, though she could not describe how. Marta checked her own shell. The collar joint was tight. The mortar was sound. The tile was warm from the morning recharge. Everything was as she had left it, but something had shifted. The Schofield shell was not her shell. It was a copy, rough, imperfect, made from whatever was available. And it worked. Not as well as hers, but well enough. That meant the principle was transferable. It did not depend on mission tile or Tomas's expertise or Marta's memory of a bakery wall. It depended on mass, and mass was everywhere, in stone, in brick, in packed earth, in anything dense enough to absorb heat and slow enough to release it. She had not just built a stove. She had found a method, and the method belonged to anyone who could carry a rock and mix mortar. The next week, 2 more families came to Marta's door. One wanted advice, the other wanted help. She gave both, and in the valley, one home at a time, the iron stoves began to disappear behind walls of stone and clay and broken tile, and the nights began to change. Silas Creed's position was eroding, and he knew it. Every family that built a shell burned less wood. Every family that burned less wood needed less credit. Every family that needed less credit was a family that owed him less, feared him less, and listened to him less. The shell was not just a stove modification, it was an economic shift. It moved power from the man who controlled the supply chain to the woman who understood the material. He did not attack Marta directly. He attacked the method. He told a family named Briggs that the mortar mix needed to be richer, more clay, less sand, because he had heard from a mason in Santa Fe that sand-heavy mortar was weak. The Briggs family followed his advice. They built a shell with clay-rich mortar at the hot zones. Within 3 thermal cycles, the mortar calcined and cracked, and the shell leaked smoke so badly that they had to tear it down. Marta heard about it from Nora. She walked to the Briggs cabin and looked at the failed shell. She picked up a piece of the cracked mortar and rubbed it between her fingers. It was chalky, calcite white, dead. "Who told you to mix it this way?" she asked. The answer came back to Creed. Marta rebuilt the Briggs shell with the correct mortar. She did not name Creed. She did not need to. The Briggs family knew who had given them the bad advice, and they knew who had come to fix it. That was enough. Trust did not need to be announced. It needed to be demonstrated, one repair joint at a time. Creed's influence was not gone. It was diminished. And diminished was worse than gone for a man like Silas, because diminished meant he could feel the ground shifting under his feet and could not stop it. By the end of January, Marta had helped build or advise on 4 shells beyond her own. Each was different materials, different stove sizes, different cabin dimensions, but each used the same principles: mass behind the stove, clearance for expansion, sand-heavy mortar at the hot zones, clean hot burns followed by coasting. The results varied. The best shells held warmth for 6 to 8 hours after the fire collapsed. The roughest held warmth for 3 to 4. All of them outperformed bare iron. She was teaching now, though she did not call it that. She called it showing. She showed women how to tap tile and stone for density. She showed men how to mix mortar by feel, sandy enough to crumble slightly in the hand, but wet enough to hold a thumbprint. She made people track their own burn times and wood consumption the way she tracked hers, with chalk marks and counts, because the numbers were the argument that no one could dismiss. She was becoming the person Tomas had tested her to become, not a builder who needed correction, but a teacher who could correct others. The knowledge had passed from her father's hand on a bakery tile to Tomas's chisel on a mission wall to her own voice in a freezing cabin. And at each passage it had grown, not changed, not distorted, but deepened by the specific problems each passage had forced it to solve. She thought of Tomas often. She did not know if his sister had recovered. She did not know if he was coming back. She kept his chisel, the one made from a railroad spike, on the shelf above the stove. And sometimes when she was teaching and someone asked a question she was not sure of, she would look at it and hear his voice. Stop building pretty. Start building honest. It was enough to continue. February was the month the valley learned to count differently. Before the shells, winter was measured in cords. How many cords stacked? How many cords burned? How many cords remaining? The arithmetic was simple and merciless. A family with a standard iron stove in a drafty cabin burned roughly a cord every 3 weeks in hard weather, faster in storms, slower in thaws. A family that started the season with 4 cords could expect to run dry by late February if the winter was average, earlier if it was cruel. Running dry meant borrowing, and borrowing meant creed. After the shells, the unit of measurement changed. Families counted armloads per night instead of cords per month. They counted hours between feedings. They counted the temperature of the tile at dawn with their palms and compared notes at the store, not with creed behind the counter, but outside on the porch, in voices low enough that the comparison itself became a kind of defiance. Marta's cabin had become a classroom, though it had no schedule and no students in the formal sense. People came when they had questions. They came when a joint cracked, when a shell smoked, when a mortar batch felt wrong in the hand. They came when their burn times did not match what Marta had described, and they wanted to know why. The answer was almost always the same. The mortar was too rich, the clearance was too tight, or the burn was too timid. Marta had learned from Tomas that the most common failure was fear. People smoldered their fires low to stretch fuel, and smoldering fires deposited creosote and produced half the heat of a clean burn. The shell required commitment. You burned hard for 90 minutes, and then you trusted the clay. Most people did not trust the clay until they had been forced to by exhaustion or by running out of wood to smolder. She taught through demonstration. She brought doubters to her own cabin and ran a full charge and coast cycle in front of them. She let them touch the shell at each stage, during the burn when the outer tile was barely warm, an hour after the burn when the outer tile was at full warmth, 4 hours after when the warmth had migrated to the far face and the inner face was cooling. She made them put their hands on the iron stove at the same time and feel the difference. The iron was cold within an hour. The clay was warm past midnight. The lesson required no words. She taught mortar mixing on the ground outside her cabin in the cold, because mortar behaved differently in cold air, and people needed to learn the feel under the conditions they would actually work in. She taught tile sorting at the ruins, where the material was still abundant enough that she could afford to let beginners crack a few pieces learning the tap and ring method. She taught burn management by sitting with families through their first overnight charge and coaching them to resist the urge to open the loading door and feed more wood when the fire went low. The hardest lesson was patience. The clay was working when the fire was not, and trusting something you could not see was harder than trusting something you could. By mid-February, 7 households within wagon distance of Pecos had some form of mass shell behind their stoves. 3 used mission tile as the primary face material. 2 used creek stone. 1 used fired adobe brick salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding. 1, Nats, the Schofield shell, Marta's roughest build, used a combination of everything available packed and mortared into a wall that was ugly and functional and warm. The results were not uniform. The tile shells performed best because fired clay had the highest thermal density and the smoothest heat release curve. The stone shells were adequate but uneven. Stone of different types held heat at different rates, and some of the creek stones contained moisture pockets that hissed and spat during the first few burns until the water cooked out. The adobe shell worked well, but was fragile, requiring more frequent mortar maintenance than tile. Marta cataloged these differences the way Tomas would have, by observation, by touch, by the patient accumulation of evidence over weeks. She was becoming the person the valley consulted when winter went wrong, not the person they admired, not the person they praised, the person they needed. There was a difference. Admiration could be withheld without cost. Need could not. Silas Creed's confrontation with that need came in the last week of February, and it came not as a moral reckoning, but as a stove fire. His store had a back room where he kept inventory and slept during the weeks when the road was too bad to reach his house north of town. The back room had an iron stove, a good one, larger than most homestead models, properly installed with a stone hearth and a tin heat shield on the wall behind it. Creed knew how to run a stove. He had been doing it for 11 years. What Creed did not know, what no one who relied on iron alone could know until the night taught them, was that a stove's peak performance and its overnight performance were different problems with different solutions, and solving one did not solve the other. His stove burned hot and well during the evening. His stove died by 3 in the morning like every other iron box in the territory. He compensated by waking to reload, the way every stove operator did, and he considered this normal because everyone he knew did the same thing. On the night of February 23rd, Creed made an error. He loaded the stove heavy with green pignon, wood that had not seasoned properly, wood that hissed and steamed instead of burning clean. He did this because his dry wood was running low, and the green wood was what remained. The green wood produced smoke and creosote, and half the heat of dry fuel. The room warmed poorly. Creed, frustrated, damped the stove to stretch the burn, which was the worst possible response. Damping a green wood fire increased creosote deposition, reduced heat output, and produced carbon monoxide that gathered in the low places of the room. He fell asleep. The fire smoldered. The room cooled. The stove choked on its own deposits, and the flame went out sometime around midnight. The temperature in the back room dropped through the floor. By 2 in the morning, the water pitcher on the counter was frozen solid. By 3, the ink in the ledger on his desk had thickened to paste. Creed woke at 4, with his fingers numb and his breath visible and the iron stove cold to the touch, dead as the stone beneath it. He could not relight. The creosote had clogged the draft. The stovepipe was coated inside with a glaze of tar that restricted airflow so badly that every attempt to light produced smoke in the room instead of flame in the firebox. He needed to clean the pipe. Cleaning the pipe required disassembly. Disassembly required taking the pipe down from the roof collar, which required going outside, which required climbing, which required hands that were not numb and a body that was not hypothermic. He sat in his back room in the dark, wrapped in blankets that smelled of smoke and lamp oil, and understood for the first time what Marta Hart had understood in August. The iron stove was not a partner. It was a dependent. It demanded constant attention, constant fuel, constant management, and the moment you failed it, even once, even for a single night, it abandoned you completely. It held nothing. It remembered nothing. It gave back nothing after the flame was gone. The next morning, when Ephraim found him shivering behind the counter with the stove still dead and the pipe still clogged, Creed did not ask Ephraim for help. He asked for Marta. She came. She brought sand, mortar clay, a chisel, and 6 tiles from her reserve stock. She brought Lena, who carried a bucket of water. She did not bring satisfaction or righteousness or the memory of every insult Creed had delivered over the past 5 months. She brought tools. She looked at the stove. She looked at the room. She looked at Creed, who stood behind the counter with his arms crossed and his face set in the expression of a man paying a debt he had hoped would never come due. "I will build you a shell," Marta said. 3 sides and a top. Stone backing from the creek bed, tile facing, sand mortar at the base, standard above. It will take 2 days. What do you want for it? Creed asked. Marta could have asked for debt forgiveness. $27 wiped clean. She could have asked for credit, for supplies, for public apology, for any of the things that the social economy of the valley would have recognized as victory. She did not. Cash for materials, she said. $3 for sand and transport. Labor from you, carrying stone, mixing mortar, holding courses while I set them. You work beside me, not behind me. Creed's jaw tightened. And no lies about where the method came from, she said. When someone asks you about the shell in your store, you tell them a woman named Marta Hart built it, and you tell them why. He was quiet for a long time. Lena watched him from beside the bucket. $3, he said. And the labor. And the labor. And the truth. He nodded. It was not a graceful concession. It was not redemption. It was a transaction between a man who had run out of options and a woman who had options to offer, and the terms were set by the woman because the knowledge was hers and the coal did not negotiate. They built the shell in 2 days. Creed hauled stone from the creek bed, his back bent under the weight, his boots wet with slush, working in silence beside a woman he had told the valley was mad. He mixed mortar to Marta's specifications, sand-heavy, crumbly, just wet enough to hold. He held tile courses in place while she set them and mortared the joints. He did not complain. He did not offer suggestions. He worked. On the second evening, Marta lit the stove and ran the first charge. The iron heated. The stone and tile began to warm. An hour later, she let the fire settle. The room held. The shell was cruder than her own. Creek stone was rougher. The courses were less even. The mortar joints were thicker, but the principle was the same, and the mass was sufficient. Creed pressed his palm to the tile at midnight. The store was closed. The lamp was low. His face in the dim light showed something that was not gratitude and was not humility. It was recognition. He had spent 5 months dismissing a thing he did not understand, and now his hand was on it, and it was warm, and his own expertise, 11 winters, good stove, proper installation, had failed him in a way this woman's strange idea had not. He did not apologize. Marta did not expect him to. An apology from Silas Creed would have been worth less than his silence, and his silence, the cessation of the talk, the end of the campaign, the quiet acknowledgement that the shells were real and the woman who built them was competent, was worth more than any words he could have offered. Within a week, a family from the north end of the valley came into the store and asked Creed about the tile structure behind his stove. He told them Marta Hart had built it. He told them why. He sold them sand and nails for the mortar work, which meant he was profiting from the method even as he endorsed it, which was so perfectly Silas that Marta laughed when she heard. But he had told the truth, and in a valley of 40 souls, the truth from Silas Creed's counter was worth more than a sermon from a pulpit. Spring came the way spring comes to the high valleys of northern New Mexico, not as warmth, but as light. The days lengthened. The snow retreated uphill. The road reappeared in stages, mud first, then ruts, then something a wagon could travel without sinking. The inspector from the land office rode through in April, counted the cabin, the stove, the children, the evidence of continuous habitation, and recorded the claim as maintained. Marta held the paper and read it the way she had read the first paper Bledsoe had brought once, then again. But this time the words were different. Maintained, demonstrated, approved. The claim was hers. She expanded the cabin that summer. Not by much, 4 feet added to the east wall, enough for a second sleeping space so the children did not share a cot. She used adobe brick for the addition, packed tight and plastered smooth, because she understood now what Tomas had spent a lifetime understanding. Mass was comfort, and thickness was safety, and the density of a wall determined not just its warmth, but its silence, its stillness, the quality of the air inside. A man named Daniel Romero appeared during the expansion. He was a teamster who hauled freight between Santa Fe and Las Vegas, a widower with a daughter grown and gone, quiet in the way of men who spend most of their time with horses and road. He appeared because Ephraim had hired him to haul stone for a chimney repair, and the stone delivery brought him past Marta's cabin on a day when she was mixing mortar in the yard. He stopped the wagon. He watched her work. He said, "You mix like Tomas Aragon." She looked up. "You know Tomas." "Everyone who hauls stone knows Tomas. He's particular about what rides in the bed." "Is he well?" Romero paused. "His sister did not recover. He is in the village caring for her children. He says he will come north in the fall." Marta nodded. She went back to mixing. Romero delivered the stone and left. He came back 2 days later with a load of sand that no one had ordered. He said Ephraim had overpaid and the surplus needed a home. Marta did not believe this, but she took the sand because sand was sand, and pride was something she had stopped confusing with strength. He came back again the following week and the week after. Each visit had a plausible reason: a stone delivery nearby, a broken axle that needed repair near her well, a message from Ephraim about roofing. Each reason was thin enough that Lena began to count the visits aloud, which embarrassed Marta and delighted Ben, who liked the horses. The courtship, if that was even the word for two tired adults circling each other through work and weather, happened over months, not weeks. Romero did not make speeches. He did not bring flowers. He hauled material. He repaired the hand sled. He built a frame for a root cellar that Marta had been digging alone. He worked beside her the way Tomas had worked beside her, not as a rescuer, but as someone who recognized competence and wanted to be near it. By autumn, he was taking meals at her table. By the first cold night of October, he was there when she lit the stove, and he watched the shell warm with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years hauling freight past cabins where women burned wood all night and never known there was another way. He touched the tile. He said, "How long does it hold?" "Depends on the burn, 4 to 6 hours on a full charge." "My cabin does not have this." "I know. I would like it to." "Then we will build one." They built his shell together in his cabin over 3 days in late October. Marta taught him the way Tomas had taught her, through action, through correction, through the patience of doing it wrong and then doing it right. He learned fast because his hands already understood stone and weight and the behavior of materials under load. What he did not understand, she explained, and what she could not explain, she showed. They married the following spring, not in a church but in Ephraim's front room, with Nora as witness and Ben carrying a ring that Romero had forged from a horseshoe nail. The ceremony was brief. The meal afterward was long. Creed was not invited but sent a sack of flour, which Marta accepted because flour was flour, and grudges did not feed children. Tomas returned in September of the following year. He was thinner. His hands shook more than they had. His sister had died in the spring, and the children he had been caring for had been placed with relatives in Albuquerque. He came north because the valley was where his work was, and work was the only thing he knew to do with grief. He came to Marta's cabin first. He stood in the doorway and looked at the shell. His shell, her shell, the thing they had built together in the worst weeks of both their lives. It was sound. The mortar was tight. The tile was uncracked. The clearance had not shifted. Marta had maintained it the way he had taught her, reading the joints each morning, replacing mortar where cycling had stressed it, keeping the collar packed with sand. He looked at the addition. He looked at the root cellar. He looked at Romero's wagon in the yard and Lena's height, 2 inches taller than when he had left, and Ben running in the yard without coughing. Marta gave him coffee. He held the cup in both hands because his fingers were cold and because holding something warm was the only comfort available to a man who had just spent 6 months watching someone die. She asked if he would stay. He said he would stay as long as there was work. She said there was work. 3 families wanted shells before winter, and 2 of the existing shells needed mortar repair, and Gus Painter wanted to rebuild his with proper tile instead of the rough stone he had started with. Tomas said, "You do not need me for that." "No," she said, "but I want you here for it." He stayed through the winter. He worked alongside Marta on 4 projects. He corrected her twice, once on a mortar joint she had allowed to go too thick. Once, on a clearance, she had set too tight on a large stove. She accepted the corrections without argument because they were right, and because being corrected by Tomas was like being corrected by the material itself, impersonal, precise, and in service of the work. In the spring, he told her he was going south again. Not for family this time, for churches. There were missions in the Rio Grande Valley that needed wall repair, and Tomas Aragon was the man who repaired them. He left his chisel. He said he would make another. She kept it on the shelf above the stove, where it stayed for the rest of her life. The years after compressed the way years do when the urgent business of survival gives way to the slower business of living. Marta and Romero raised the children. Lena grew into a young woman who could sort tile by ring and mix mortar by feel and explain the physics of thermal mass to anyone who asked, which she did with the same calm specificity her mother used. Ben grew into a boy and then a young man who never entirely lost the wheeze from that first winter, but who was alive to lose it, which was the only thing that mattered. The shells spread beyond the valley. Marta did not advertise. She did not travel to teach. The knowledge moved the way frontier knowledge always moved, from cabin to cabin, from neighbor to cousin, from one woman watching another woman work and filing the lesson away the way Marta had filed her father's lesson in the bakery. Within 3 years, variations of the mass shell appeared in homesteads as far north as Mora and as far south as the Estancia Valley. Some used tile, some used stone, some used adobe brick or fired clay formed in crude molds and baked in pit kilns. The materials changed. The principle did not. Marta secured full title to the claim. She expanded the cabin twice more. She planted the garden Owen had talked about, and it produced, and the produce fed her family and her neighbors and the families who came to learn. She aged the way frontier women aged, faster than the calendar suggested, marked by labor and weather, and the particular erosion that comes from carrying more than your body was built to carry and refusing to set it down. Romero hauled freight until his knees would not let him climb the wagon. Then he repaired wagons. Then he sat in the yard and talked to the horses and watched Marta work and handed her tools when she asked for them, which was its own kind of partnership and its own kind of love. Marta Hart lived out her years on the claim east of the Santa Fe Road, within sight of the mission ruins where she had first picked up a tile and felt the warmth moving through it. She became known in the valley not as a widow or a curiosity, but as the woman who understood heat, a title that carried more practical weight than any honor a government could bestow. When early cold caught a family unprepared, they came to Marta. When a stove smoked or a chimney failed or a cabin would not hold warmth past midnight, they came to Marta. She never refused. She never charged more than materials and labor. She never forgot that the knowledge had come to her through 2 men's hands, her father's, pressing her palm to glaze tile in a bakery, and Tomas's, tapping a mission wall to find the fragments that remembered fire. She died on a spring morning when the valley was green and the ruins were gold in the early light. Lena was beside her. Ben was in the yard. The stove was cold because it was warm enough to leave it, but the shell was there. The original shell. 20 years of mortar repairs and tile replacements layered over the skeleton Tomas had helped her build, and if you pressed your hand to it, you could feel the faintest trace of the morning sun working through the clay, slow and steady, the way heat moves through anything dense enough to hold it. 12 families in the Pecos Valley had learned from Marta Hart. Dozens more had learned from the families who learned from her. The original mission tiles, the ones she had hauled on a hand sled with a sick child in the blankets, and a 9-year-old counting fragments, were still in the wall, still holding, still doing what fired clay does when it is set right and mortared honest, remembering heat long after the fire forgets it. The thing that Silas Creed had called a mud grave for a fire became the quietest, most durable answer the valley had ever found to the oldest problem on the frontier: how to make warmth last, not how to make it hotter, not how to make it louder, not how to throw more fuel at a box of iron that would scream for an hour and then go silent, how to make it last. The answer was not iron. The answer was the material that surrounded iron, the mass that absorbed the shout and gave it back as a whisper, hour after hour, through the darkest and coldest part of the night. On the worst nights, when the temperature dropped past 20 below and the wind stripped the ridge bare and the pinon cracked from the cold, a traveler passing through the Pecos Basin might have noticed something strange about the cabins dotted along the valley floor. The stovepipes carried thin smoke, not thick. The windows glowed faintly but steadily, without the surging brightness that marked a fresh feeding. The chimneys did not cough. The cabin sat quiet, patient, warm. Inside one of them, the one closest to the ruins, the one with the addition on the east wall and the root cellar and the wagon ruts in the yard, a child slept without coughing. A woman's hand rested on terracotta that was still warm at dawn, still giving back what the fire had poured into it hours before, still answering the question that the iron had never thought to ask. Iron had shouted for an hour. The clay was still speaking at dawn,